Welcome to week 6 of the short row sleeve cap cowl, and we're on to the home straight now. This week I'm going to talk about finishing parts. We're going to talk about the hem, necklines and button bands. So first off, we're going to have an update on my sweater progress. So far I've just added the hem. Obviously I've got my finished sleeves from last week. I've actually extended the number of stitches in this hem just to make it a little bit longer. This was quite a cropped sweater, and I've also, where I've slip stitched into the base of the sweater, I've towards the edges slip stitched into 3 stitches on that base round instead of 2, just to pull it in slightly at the edges. I've also increased from 9 to 15 stitches, so this is what my ribbing looks like. Next I'm going to move on to the neckline. Now I've got the original sweater here just to show you how in this neckline you can see it looks quite angular and you've got this flat bit, and I know when I made this neckline I was a little bit worried about how this shape was going to work. But if we look at the sweater, so this is my original sample. You can see the neckline there, which is exactly the same as the other one. I've got a little bit of a pull there where I've been wearing this and dropped it on my on my chair. So you can see it's actually really quite a round neckline. So that's exactly the same as what I've got here, but it does, once you've put the collar on, for want of a better word, it's a neckline trim, whatever term you want to describe it. But you can see it really softens out that and turns it into a curve, and that's really why this finishing is so important to take your time with, make sure you're happy with, because it can really make the finished garment. So now we're going to have a look at the cardigan. Here is my original cardigan sample, and I've just popped a piece of A4 paper in the centre just to make it a little bit easier to see this neckline ribbing. I touched on this last week, but I've used a slightly different approach to ribbing on the neckline. The hem and the cuffs are the same. Stitch count is a little different, I think. I've used a slightly different method. Well, I've used the same method, but horizontally for the button band. So this neckline, when you work it up and around the neck and back round, but in this section you're kind of still going to use that same principle of slip stitching into this. So we work into the row ends along that slant of the neckline, but on top of what we're doing there, we're going to be actually increasing at the top and decreasing at the bottom. I really hope I've got that the right way around. It's all in the pattern, but I just wanted to kind of give you that visual of how this is worked. So essentially this slant is actually created by increases rather than sort of increase here, decrease here, which allows it to remain vertical, rather than if you worked it the same way you work the cuff, for example, then your ribbing is going to be at right angles to this slant. So it was the first time I've used this technique, and when I was designing this cardigan, I kind of played around with the best way to do it. And you kind of increase, decrease, going up the other side and then up the first side, and then do the reverse. So you're kind of, if you're coming down, you will pop a decrease and an increase here so you've got the same number of stitches in each rib. You're just sort of stepping them down. This makes a lot more sense when you're actually working it, but I just wanted to point it out because it is something that's quite different in this design. I've never used it before, but I think I will use the technique again in other designs, especially if you like a V-neck but maybe don't want that kind of, overlap. Sometimes when you have a V-neck ribbing and it comes to the middle, it doesn't quite work out. This one, let me just use my left hand for this because it's a bit easier. So this one, it kind of comes to a flat where you've got the button band. So you kind of have that little squared off bit at the base when it's buttoned up. But once it's on, it kind of looks like a nice scoop neck. So here is the traditional type of neckline ribbing, the same as the hem, where you slip stitch into that kind of base round, and you can see that the angle of these ribs changes with the neckline versus here where they all stay straight. So I just thought it might be useful to show you the comparison, just to highlight the difference in the two techniques. So for the button band, I've used this same half double crochet front third loop technique as I have on the hem, and essentially you've just got a continuation of this, but you've obviously got much longer ribs because the ribs go vertically right up the side. On this side that I've put the buttons on, and I know there's a traditional left and right button side, and I have a feeling I got it backwards on this, but you can do which you prefer. So on this side, there's no holes in it. This is essentially just the ribbing worked right the way up the front opening. This side, I've got some little buttonholes, which essentially are just about skipping stitches. I have a post about how to crochet or create a generic crochet button band. Now there's various ways you can do it. I always like to use a rib stitch because I like the look it gives. Not always, sometimes I'll just work some rows of single crochet, but I'll link to the post that talks about that. It's quite useful just to understand the principle, you know, which is basically one side you need holes, one side you got to put the buttons. The way I approach it is I will place the buttons roughly how I want them to be. So I've got 7 in this, so I actually used stitch counts on this to make sure I had the same number of stitches between each button. And you can use the top and bottom if you've got kind of a remainder, so if it's not exactly divisible by well, you actually count the gaps rather than the buttons if you want these gaps to be the same distance apart. So I've got 6 caps for 7 buttons, and then a little bit either side at the top and bottom. So once you've kind of worked out the placement, I pop the stitch markers on the side I'm going to put the buttonhole in, and then I know how to create my buttonhole. Generally I create buttonholes by chaining and skipping a stitch. When you're working in ribbing, I have a separate tutorial actually for creating a hidden buttonhole, which is great if you're kind of working typical horizontal ribbing. You can use the same technique when working this way, but essentially you'll either have a buttonhole that's that way or that way, which with these very small buttons doesn't really matter. If you've got bigger buttons, you might want to think more about, you know, if you have a button that size, you're going to want your buttonhole to go that way, because obviously that way it's not going to fit in the button band. So have a think about those things if you are using a different kind of number size of buttons. So that's really, I think, what I wanted to address with the cardigan and how that differs from the sweater. I'm going to go off and finish my neckline on my pink sweater, and then I will come back and I'll show you the almost finished item. And there, ends and all, we have my sort of finished sweater. So I finished the neckline, pleased with how that's come out. Obviously got some ends to sew in. This is still the wrong side I'm showing you. So one little tip I want to share about how I make my ribbing, which is, I think, on my guide to ribbing. I love that curve. You see what I mean about how it looks like an odd shape, but once you put the neckline on, you get a really nice curve. So when I do the last stitch on each row, I tend to either, and this does depend what style of ribbing I'm using, either crochet through the top loops on the last stitch. So if I'm working, for example, if I'm working back loop only ribbing, or in this case it's front third loop, when I get to the last stitch, I might work in both loops of the final stitch just on this top side, because it keeps a nice edge. What I actually did with this is I worked kind of through the turning chain. So I use a chain 1 to turn. So my last stitch I actually kind of worked through the turning chain, because sometimes the first stitch up here can get a little bit squashed. I found that just gave a nice neat consistent look on the edge. So you can see this will be the wrong side. This, once I've blocked it, will be what the right side looks like. So there we have it. Time for some blocking and a lot of ends to weave in. And then next week, you'll get to see the finished piece.